You know, I've always considered myself a pretty reasonable guy. I like my peace and quiet, I follow the rules, I pay my taxes, the whole 9 yards. So when I bought a modest little place in a supposedly upscale HOA community, I figured it'd be smooth sailing, a place to unwind, maybe do a bit of gardening, enjoy the meticulously manicured lawns I was paying a hefty sum for. What I didn't bank on was suburban dictator Barbie, otherwise known as Karen, our esteemed HOA president. And I certainly didn't foresee a future where I'd be calculating the aggregate purchase price of an entire residential development just to make a point. But hey, life's full of surprises, isn't it? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because this story, well, it's one for the books. It all started, as these things often do, with something utterly ridiculous: my cars. I own two: a sensible sedan for daily driving and an older classic pickup I've been restoring. Both were always parked neatly in my driveway or, in the case of the pickup when I was actively working on it, in my garage. Never on the street, never blocking anything, never an eyesore, unless you consider a lovingly maintained piece of automotive history an eyesore, which apparently Karen did. The first notice was polite enough, in that passive-aggressive HOA kind of way. A little slip of paper, citing some obscure bylaw about vehicle aesthetics and maintaining community standards. It vaguely suggested that having project vehicles visible was frowned upon, even if said project vehicle was, at that point, mostly under a cover in my own driveway while I waited for a specific part. I chuckled, crumpled it up, and made sure the cover was extra secure. I figured it was just a standard, overly zealous welcome to the neighborhood gesture. Boy, was I wrong. A week later, another notice. This one was sterner, mentioning potential fines. And it specifically referenced excessive vehicles. Now, I'm no math whiz, but 2 cars for a single-family dwelling didn't strike me as excessive. Especially considering Karen, our HOA president, who lived 3 doors down in a house that looked like a McMansion had mated with a wedding cake, regularly had 3 vehicles parked in her oversized driveway. There was the gleaming white Escalade, vanity plates proclaiming Karen 1, subtle, I know, her husband's equally obnoxious muscle car that he only revved on weekends, and what looked like a permanently stationed luxury sedan for, I don't know, her prize-winning poodle to be chauffeured in. The hypocrisy was so blatant it was almost funny. Almost. I decided a calm, rational conversation was in order. I caught Karen during one of her neighborhood patrols, where she'd glide down the street in her Escalade, windows tinted, occasionally slowing to squint disapprovingly at a rogue dandelion or a child's bicycle left momentarily unattended. I flagged her down politely. She lowered her window about 3 inches, peering at me over the top of enormous sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. "Yes?" she'd said, her voice dripping with the kind of bored condescension usually reserved for telemarketers. I explained the notices, pointed out I only had 2 vehicles, both properly parked, and then, perhaps foolishly, gestured towards her own driveway. I said, trying to keep my tone light, "I notice you have 3 vehicles, and I wasn't aware of any 2-car limit per household. That was a mistake." Her perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up. The sunglasses slid down her nose a fraction, revealing eyes that could freeze lava. "My vehicles," she enunciated, as if speaking to a particularly dim-witted toddler, "are appropriate for the status of this community. Yours are questionable, and the rules, Mr. Henderson, are for those who need them." She then delivered a lecture on how the HOA was dedicated to maintaining property values and a certain standard, and how my accumulation of vehicles was not conducive to that. Accumulation of 2. I tried to reason, to point out the actual wording of the bylaws I'd since looked up, which were vague at best and certainly didn't specify a hard number or type, beyond basic operational and non-commercial use. She wasn't having it. The window glided up, a silent dismissal. The fine arrived a few days later. $100 for excessive vehicle count and unapproved vehicle type. I paid it, just to avoid immediate escalation, but the injustice of it gnawed at me. This wasn't about rules, it was about power. Karen had decided she didn't like my cars, or maybe just me, and she was going to use the HOA as her personal hammer. I'm a patient man, but I also have a very strong aversion to bullies and arbitrary uses of authority. My background, you see, isn't in gardening or quiet retirement. I spent 20 years in corporate finance, specializing in acquisitions and, let's say, hostile restructurings. I knew how to read a balance sheet, a contract, and more importantly, people. And Karen, with her cheap perfume and expensive insecurity, was an open book written in very large, very annoying print. This wasn't going to end with a $100 fine. This was just the opening salvo in a war I hadn't asked for, but one I was increasingly prepared to fight and win. Little did she know, her petty crusade over my two perfectly legitimate cars was about to set in motion a chain of events that would see her regal kingdom crumble to dust. The thought even then brought a small, grim smile to my face. She was about to find out that Mr. Henderson was a lot more than just the quiet guy with the old pickup truck. The fines kept coming like clockwork. First, it was another 100 for the cars. Then, 50 for my grass being allegedly a quarter-inch too high the day before the scheduled landscaping service was due. Then, a truly Kafkaesque $75 for improperly stored refuse containers because I dared to put my bins out at 7 p.m. the night before pickup, instead of the apparently divinely ordained hour of 6 a.m. on pickup day itself. Each citation was delivered with a smug little note, often handwritten by Karen herself, filled with passive-aggressive pronouncements about community responsibility. I documented everything, meticulously. Every notice, every check I wrote for these ludicrous fines, every photograph I took of Karen's own transgressions, her 3 cars perpetually displayed like trophies, her sometimes overflowing trash cans, recudel by Tennessums, recudel Blake and very ham sace. The slightly ostentatious holiday decorations she left up well into February. I even started taking time-stamped photos of my own lawn immediately after the landscapers left, just to have proof against the inevitable grass-too-high ticket. It was exhausting and, frankly, insulting. I tried attending an HOA meeting. It was held in the small clubhouse, a building that reeked of stale coffee and Karen's overbearing perfume. The board consisted of Karen, of course, looking like a minor despot on her slightly elevated chair, and 2 other individuals who I privately nicknamed Nodder and Shrugger. Nodder was a nervous-looking man who agreed with everything Karen said, his head bobbing like a dashboard toy. Shrugger was a woman who seemed perpetually bewildered, offering non-committal shrugs whenever a difficult question arose, which wasn't often, as Karen dominated the proceedings. When I attempted to raise the issue of the vehicle fines and the selective enforcement, Karen cut me off mid-sentence. "Mr. Henderson," she trilled, a saccharine smile plastered on her face that didn't reach her cold eyes. "We've already discussed your particular situation. The board's decision is final. We have many important community matters to attend to." Nodder nodded vigorously. Shrugger shrugged. A few other residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. It was clear Karen had cultivated an atmosphere of either fear or apathy, maybe both. I wasn't just going to roll over. My next step was to consult an old colleague, a lawyer named Ben, who specialized in contract law and, as luck would have it, had dealt with a few particularly nasty HOA disputes in his career. I laid out the situation, showed him my documentation, the photos, the bylaws. Ben listened patiently, occasionally letting out a low whistle. "Classic HOA overreach," he said, leaning back in his chair. "This Karen sounds like a real piece of work. You can fight these fines individually, maybe win some, lose some. It'll be a long, draining process, or," he paused, a glint in his eye, "or you could look at the bigger picture." He explained that HOAs, while powerful within their defined scope, were still bound by their own governing documents and state laws. He suggested a deep dive into the HOA's formation documents, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CCRs, and, crucially, the land ownership records for the entire development. "Sometimes," Ben said, "these communities are set up in ways that aren't immediately obvious. You might find leverage where you least expect it." That's when the gears in my old financial brain really started to turn. Leverage. That was a language I understood. I thanked Ben, paid his consultation fee, and headed straight for the county records office. I spent the next 2 weeks buried in dusty deed books, plat maps, and incorporation papers. It was tedious, painstaking work, deciphering legalese and tracing ownership histories. Most of it was standard stuff, but then I found it. The golden ticket. The entire development, Willow Creek Estates, as it was so pretentiously named, wasn't comprised of fee-simple properties where homeowners owned their house and the land beneath it. No, the homeowners owned their physical structures, the houses themselves, but the land, all of it, every single lot, every blade of grass in the common areas, was under a 99-year master land lease. And that master lease was held by a single, rather obscure corporation, Willow Creek Holdings LLC, which, according to further research, was set up by the original developer decades ago and now seemed to be managed by a distant, out-of-state trust company that likely viewed it as just another line item on a vast portfolio. The HOA, Karen's Little Empire, was essentially a sub-entity contracted by Willow Creek Holdings to manage the day-to-day operations and enforce the community rules on behalf of the landowners, the actual landowners. Suddenly, Karen's power seemed a lot less absolute. She was a queen, yes, but a queen ruling a rented castle, and she didn't even know who her landlord truly was. The implications hit me like a ton of bricks. If someone controlled Willow Creek Holdings LLC, they controlled the land. They controlled everything. They were, in effect, the ultimate HOA. A very interesting, very expensive, but very, very tempting thought began to form in my mind. What if I became the landlord? The thought was audacious, almost laughably so. Buying an entire neighborhood's underlying land just to deal with a petty HOA tyrant? It sounded like something out of a movie. But the more I considered it, the more feasible it seemed, especially given my professional background. I wasn't just some disgruntled homeowner, I was someone who had spent a career navigating complex financial deals, assessing value, and executing large-scale acquisitions. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, though the thought of Karen's face when she found out was certainly a motivating factor. It was about solving a problem in the most definitive way possible. It was also, I realized, with a clinical detachment, potentially a sound, if unconventional, investment if handled correctly. The neighborhood was well located, the houses themselves generally well maintained despite Karen's reign. The current land lease agreement, from what I could decipher, was probably undervalued given current market rates in the region. My first step was to discreetly investigate Willow Creek Holdings LLC. This took some doing. The trust company managing it was deliberately opaque, as these entities often are. But I had resources, contacts from my old life. I engaged a private investigator, someone I'd used before for due diligence on corporate deals, a quiet professional named Marcus who specialized in untangling complex ownership structures. Marcus was worth every penny. Within a week, he had a name, a direct contact for the person at the trust company who was responsible for overseeing the Willow Creek Holdings asset. It turned out to be a rather disinterested portfolio manager named Mr. Abernathy, based in a different state entirely, who, from Marcus's brief report, seemed more concerned with his golf handicap than a relatively small land lease in a town he'd probably never visited. This was promising. Disinterest often meant a willingness to divest if the price was right and the hassle minimal. Next, I needed to understand the exact terms of the land leases for the individual homeowners. I managed to obtain a copy of a standard lease agreement from a neighbor, Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who was one of the original residents. She, too, had run afoul of Karen, something about unapproved garden gnomes, and was surprisingly willing to share her documents once I explained I was looking into the HOA's broader legal standing. The lease terms were long, 99 years as I'd seen, with provisions for renewal, but critically, they were leases. The homeowners owned the improvements, their houses, but paid ground rent for the land. The HOA was the designated agent for collecting this ground rent and managing the covenants on behalf of Willow Creek Holdings. This structure, while not unheard of, is less common these days and often leads to complications as leases age or property values diverge from ground rent schedules. Perfect. Complications were my specialty. I then began to quietly assess the total value of the underlying land for the entire Willow Creek estates. This involved looking at comparable land sales, zoning regulations, and potential for future development or redevelopment, even though my immediate plan wasn't necessarily to bulldoze the place. I needed a solid number to make an offer. I also started setting up a new anonymous LLC, let's call it Serene Valley Properties LLC, through which I would make the acquisition if it came to that. Anonymity was key at this stage. I didn't want Karen or anyone else in the HOA getting wind of what I was contemplating. The image of her face, should this plan succeed, was a powerful motivator, a little screensaver of future satisfaction playing in my mind. The hardest part was initiating contact with Mr. Abernathy at the trust company without raising alarms. I couldn't just call up and say, "Hi, I'm a disgruntled resident looking to buy your entire neighborhood out from under our HOA president." So, I had Ben, my lawyer, make the initial approach. Lawyers talking to trust managers is a common occurrence. Ben framed it as an inquiry from an investment group, Serene Valley Properties LLC, of course, interested in long-term land lease portfolios. No mention of Willow Creek Estates specifically at first. Just a general expression of interest. Mr. Abernathy, true to Marcus's assessment, was initially lukewarm. His trust managed many such assets. But Ben was persistent, gently steering the conversation over a couple of calls towards smaller, perhaps underperforming or administratively burdensome assets. Eventually, Willow Creek Holdings LLC came up. Abernathy confirmed it was in their portfolio. Ben expressed polite interest. The first hook was set. The quiet before the storm was almost palpable. Karen continued her petty reign, finding someone for a slightly discolored shingle, another for excessive bird feeder activity. She had no idea the ground beneath her perfectly manicured kingdom was, quite literally, about to shift. And I was the one causing the earthquake. The negotiation for Willow Creek Holdings LLC was a masterclass in patience and subtlety, orchestrated largely by Ben, with me feeding him directives and financial models from behind the scenes. Mr. LLC was a masterclass in patience. By him Dockling. Abernathy, representing the trust, was predictably cautious. These old trusts don't like sudden moves. They prefer the slow, steady erosion of time or, failing that, a clean, uncomplicated exit. Our strategy was to present Serene Valley Properties LLC as a no-nonsense, professional investment firm looking to acquire a portfolio of land lease assets, with Willow Creek being one of several potential targets. We never let on that Willow Creek was our primary target. We made it clear we were prepared for a quick all-cash deal, assuming the due diligence checked out and the price was reasonable. Cash and speed are often persuasive arguments when dealing with entities keen to simplify their holdings. The due diligence phase was intense. I personally reviewed every document related to Willow Creek Holdings, the original land grants, the master lease agreement, the financial statements, which were surprisingly thin, mostly just ground rent income minus some basic administrative fees, and the agreement with the Willow Creek Estates HOA. This is where my financial background truly came into its own. I identified that the ground rents hadn't been significantly adjusted in years and were probably below market rate, meaning there was upside potential for a new owner. More importantly, for my immediate purposes, the master agreement with the HOA was surprisingly loose. It granted the HOA broad powers to manage the community and enforce covenants, but it also contained clauses allowing the landowner, Willow Creek Holdings, to terminate the management agreement with due cause or, more simply, not renew it upon its expiry, which was, conveniently, only 2 years away. Even better, there were provisions for the landowner to directly appoint board members to the HOA if certain conditions of mismanagement or financial instability were met, conditions that, with Karen at the helm, might not be too hard to subtly engineer or at least argue. While these larger machinations were underway, I also started a secondary, much quieter operation, acquiring the actual houses, the improvements, from any willing sellers within Willow Creek Estates. This was a longer-term play, but it served multiple purposes. Firstly, it would give me direct control over individual properties, strengthening my eventual position. Secondly, it would allow me to remove these properties from Karen's sphere of influence if I chose to rent them out under different terms or even leave them temporarily vacant. Thirdly, every house I bought meant one less voting member beholden to Karen in any future HOA disputes, though my ultimate plan aimed to bypass the traditional HOA power structure entirely. I used a different LLC for these purchases, let's call it Neighborhood Renewal Group. again to maintain anonymity. I targeted properties that came onto the market naturally, and also made discreet, above-market offers to a few residents I knew were unhappy with Karen's regime or were looking to move for other reasons. Mrs. Gable, the gnome enthusiast, was one of the first to sell to me. She was delighted, taking her gnomes and a tidy profit to a smaller HOA-free cottage across town. "Give that Karen hell, dear," she'd said with a wink as she handed over the keys. Each successful house purchase was a small victory, a brick removed from Karen's fortress. I made sure the transactions were handled through an intermediary real estate agent, one known for discretion, so my name never appeared directly. The funds were wired from neighborhood renewal groups' accounts, which were, of course, funded by me, but structured to be opaque. Karen, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the tectonic plates shifting beneath her. She was too busy. I heard she'd initiated a campaign to standardize mailbox colors, a truly pressing issue, and was holding emergency HOA meetings to discuss the urgent crisis of unapproved petunias in somebody's flower bed. The sheer pettiness was astounding, but it kept her distracted. She probably noticed that a few houses were selling, but likely attributed it to normal market churn. She might have even been pleased, imagining new, compliant residents moving in, eager to follow her every decree. The negotiations with Mr. Abernathy for Willow Creek Holdings dragged on for nearly 6 months. There were offers, counteroffers, endless requests for more documentation from their side, all standard corporate mating dance rituals. Ben handled most of the direct communication, his calm, lawyerly demeanor a perfect foil to my barely suppressed eagerness. Finally, we reached an agreement. The price was substantial, a significant investment, but one I had calculated carefully. It was fair market value for the land asset, perhaps even slightly favorable to me given the locked-in, below-market ground rents that I knew I could eventually adjust. The day the purchase agreement for Willow Creek Holdings LLC was signed by both parties, contingent on final closing, was a quiet day for me. No celebrations, no fist pumps, just a deep, cold sense of satisfaction. The biggest piece of the puzzle was now falling into place. Karen's reign as Queen of Willow Creek Estates was living on borrowed time. She just didn't know it yet. The ground beneath her Escalade polished throne was about to become mine. The closing on Willow Creek Holdings LLC was an anticlimax, a flurry of signatures and wire transfers handled by lawyers and escrow agents. One moment, the trust company owned the land. The next, Serene Valley Properties LLC, my LLC, owned it. I was now effectively the landlord of the entire Willow Creek Estates. Every homeowner, including Karen, was now technically my tenant, at least for the ground beneath their houses. The power dynamic had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. For a few weeks I did nothing. I let the ink dry, literally and figuratively. I wanted to ensure all legal filings were complete, all I's dotted and T's crossed. Meanwhile, Neighborhood Renewal Group continued its quiet acquisition of individual houses. By this point, I owned 7 properties outright within the development, in addition to the master land lease for all of them. These 7 houses were now, in a sense, doubly mine. Karen, of course, was oblivious. Her focus remained on her micro-tyranny. I received another fine, this time for improperly pruned shrubbery. A new one. I almost framed it. It was a testament to her dedication to the absurd. The HOA's regular monthly meeting was approaching, and I decided this would be the perfect venue for the grand reveal. I didn't need to overthrow her through votes anymore. I owned the game board. But there was a certain theatricality to confronting her in her own power center that appealed to my sense of justice. A few days before the meeting, I had Ben draft a formal letter. It was addressed to the Willow Creek Estates HOA Board of Directors, specifically to Karen as president. The letter was simple. It announced the change in ownership of Willow Creek Holdings LLC, the master landowner, to Serene Valley Properties LLC. It further stated that, as the new landowner, Serene Valley Properties LLC was invoking its rights under the master agreement to review the current HOA management contract and, more immediately, to appoint a representative to the HOA board. That representative, the letter concluded, would be me, Mr. Henderson. The letter was sent via registered mail, Return receipt requested. Time to arrive the day before the HOA meeting. I imagined Karen's face as she signed for it, perhaps expecting another resident's complaint or a vendor invoice. The thought was delicious. On the evening of the HOA meeting, I arrived a few minutes late, deliberately. The small clubhouse was moderately full. Karen was at her usual perch, flanked by Nodder and Shrugger. She was mid-sentence, discussing, with great solemnity, the pressing issue of holiday decoration timelines. She paused as I entered, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face at the interruption. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice tight. "You're late. We're discussing the Christmas light policy. I saw the registered mail envelope on the table in front of her, unopened. Perfect." "Actually, Karen," I said, my voice calm and clear, cutting through the room, "I believe there's a more pressing item for the agenda. Perhaps you should open your mail." All eyes turned to her. She looked down at the envelope, then back at me, a confused frown on her face. Nodder looked nervous. Shrugger seemed, well, shruggier than usual. Slowly, Karen picked up the envelope and tore it open. Her eyes scanned the first few lines. I watched as the color drained from her face. The smugness, the imperial confidence, it all just evaporated. She read it again, her lips moving silently. The room was dead quiet. You could have heard a pin drop, or perhaps the distant sound of a poorly pruned shrub shedding a leaf in defiance. This can't be right," she stammered, looking up at me, her voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" "It's quite simple, Karen," I replied, stepping forward. "It's a notification that the land your house sits on, the land all these houses sit on, has a new owner. That owner is a company I control. And as the representative of that company, per the master agreement you seem to have overlooked in your zealous enforcement of Petunia placement, I am now a de facto member of this board. In fact," I let a small smile play on my lips, "given that I own the very ground we're standing on, and also now own 7 voting properties within this association, I believe that makes me the majority stakeholder by several different metrics. So, yes, we can discuss Christmas lights, or we could discuss the future of this HOA's management. Your choice." The silence that followed was profound. Karen just stared, speechless, the letter trembling in her hand. Nodder looked like he was about to faint. Shrugger actually looked intrigued for the first time. The game had changed. Checkmate. The aftermath of that HOA meeting was, to put it mildly, chaotic for Karen, profoundly satisfying for me, and a mixture of shock, disbelief, and, for some, quiet relief for the other residents. Karen, after her initial stunned silence, tried to bluster. "This is outrageous. You can't just buy the neighborhood," she sputtered, her face flushed a rather unbecoming shade of puce that clashed horribly with her expensive turquoise tracksuit. "Actually, Karen," I replied, my voice still infuriatingly calm to her, "I can, and I did. Or rather, my company bought the master land lease, which, for all intents and purposes, means I control the land. And as for the houses, well, Neighborhood Renewal Group has been quite active in the market lately. I believe we own, let's see, I made a show of counting on my fingers. Yes, 7 properties now, soon to be 8. That gives me considerable voting power too, wouldn't you say?" Nodder just kept shaking his head, muttering, "Unbelievable, just unbelievable." Shrugger, bless her, actually piped up, "Well, it certainly explains the uptick in sales." Karen shot her a venomous glare, which Shrugger met with a surprisingly defiant shrug. The other residents were murmuring amongst themselves. A few looked scared, a few looked angry, but a surprising number looked hopeful. I addressed the room. "Let me be clear," I said. "My primary issue was never with the concept of an HOA, or with reasonable community standards. My issue was with the arbitrary and unfair application of rules, with the abuse of power, and with a distinct lack of common sense and decency." I looked directly at Karen. "This HOA, under its current leadership, has become a vehicle for personal vendettas and petty tyranny. That ends tonight. My first official act, using the authority vested in Serene Valley Properties LLC as the landowner, was to call for an immediate vote of no confidence in Karen as president and in Nodder as treasurer. He also, predictably, handled the finances with the same lack of scrutiny he applied to Karen's pronouncements. With my 7 property votes, plus a few other disgruntled residents who were now emboldened to raise their hands, the motion passed overwhelmingly. Karen was speechless, then furious. "You can't do this. I'll sue. I'll call my lawyer," she shrieked. "Please do," I said. "I'm sure Ben, my lawyer, would be happy to speak with him. He's quite familiar with the intricacies of land lease agreements and HOA governance." Ben, who had discreetly entered and was standing at the back of the room, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The next step was the evictions, though it wasn't quite as dramatic as kicking them all to the curb overnight. As the landowner, Serene Valley Properties LLC had the right not to renew the individual ground leases upon their natural expiry or, in cases of clear and persistent breaches of covenant, which Karen herself had been committing with her selective enforcement and potential mismanagement, to terminate them with proper legal notice. For most residents, I had no intention of doing so. My goal was reform, not mass displacement. I immediately announced that Serene Valley Properties would be working to install a new, fair, and transparent HOA board, and that we would be reviewing all current bylaws for reasonableness. The oppressive fines would cease. The focus would be on actual community well-being, not on the color of mailboxes. For Karen, her husband, and her 2 closest cronies on the board, Nodder and one other particularly odious sycophant who usually managed to miss meetings but always voted Karen's way via proxy, it was a different story. Their ground leases, I discovered through a thorough review, had clauses related to maintaining community harmony and acting in good faith as representatives of the HOA, which their actions had clearly violated. More simply, their leases, like all others, had renewal dates. I instructed Ben to prepare non-renewal notices for their land leases, giving them the legally required amount of time to vacate the properties. They owned their houses, the physical structures, and I made them fair market offers to purchase these structures through Neighborhood Renewal Group. They could take the offer, or they could attempt the rather complicated and expensive process of physically moving their houses off my land. Karen, predictably, refused the initial offer for her McMansion. She threatened lawsuits, injunctions, eternal damnation. Ben handled her lawyer with professional aplomb. The law was clear. She owned the house, I owned the land. Her right to keep her house on my land was expiring. Nodder, surprisingly, took the offer for his much more modest home almost immediately. He seemed relieved to be out from under Karen's thumb and the whole mess. Schrugger, who had never really been a problem and had actually shown some spine at the end, had her lease renewed without issue. She later told me she was considering running for the new reformed HOA board. The few other residents who had been part of Karen's inner circle of enablers also received non-renewal notices for their land leases and buyout offers for their homes. Most took the deals, grumbling but ultimately recognizing the game was up. As for Karen, after months of bluster and legal threats that went nowhere, she finally caved and sold her house to my LLC for a price slightly less than my initial generous offer, mostly due to her lawyer's fees eating into her potential profit. The day she moved out, in her Escalade, Karen One Plates now looking rather forlorn, was a day of quiet celebration for many in Willow Creek Estates. I didn't watch her leave. I didn't need to. My point had been made. The neighborhood changed after that. I worked with the remaining residents to establish a new, streamlined HOA. We slashed the ridiculous rules, kept only the ones that made sense for maintaining property values and general civility. The fees were actually lowered, as we cut out the wasteful spending Karen had indulged in, like the excessively elaborate holiday decorations that only she seemed to want. The atmosphere became lighter, more neighborly. People started talking to each other again, no longer afraid of being reported for some imaginary infraction. I eventually sold the houses Neighborhood Renewal Group had acquired, one by one, to new families, ensuring they understood and were comfortable with the reformed HOA structure and the land lease arrangement, which I made sure was fair and transparent. I even sold Willow Creek Holdings LLC itself, about 2 years later, to a responsible long-term property management company that was committed to maintaining the fair system we'd established, netting myself a tidy profit on the entire endeavor. My too many cars problem had resulted in me buying a neighborhood, ousting a tyrant, reforming a community, and making a decent return on investment. Not bad for a guy who just wanted to work on his old pickup in peace. Sometimes the most ridiculous problems require the most comprehensive solutions. And let me tell you, the peace and quiet in my own driveway these days, it's priceless. No Karens in sight. Just the gentle hum of a well-tuned engine, and the satisfying knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, the little guy with a bit of know-how and a lot of patience can indeed move mountains, or in this case, buy the land underneath them.